It is October 1944. A cold autumn wind blows through a newly liberated village near Luneville, France. Mud clings to the boots of passing infantrymen, and the rumble of distant American artillery shakes the damp air. In the center of the village square stands a stone church, its belfry completely empty and silent. A local priest stands on the steps, staring up at the vacant tower with hollow eyes. He approaches a group of passing American soldiers, his voice trembling as he describes how the occupying forces tore down the town's ancient bronze bell 2 years ago to feed their war machine. He begs the Americans for any bell they can find, pleading to break the heavy silence that has gripped his people for 2 long years. General Patton will soon hear this plea, and he will launch an unexpected military hunt to restore what was stolen. This is the story of what General Patton did when a local priest revealed that his small French village had been forced into absolute silence for 2 long years without its historic church bell. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We tell the World War II stories that show humanity in the darkest places. Father Michel Dupin was 62 years old. He had spent exactly 30 years serving the small parish church of Saint Martin near Luneville. He knew every family in the valley, having baptized the infants, married the young couples, and buried the elders across 3 full generations. The church tower was not just an architectural feature to him. It was his pulpit to the wider world. The heavy bronze bell inside it had been his physical voice, calling the faithful to Sunday Mass, warning them of approaching summer storms, and marking the daily passage of time for working men in the fields. When the occupying forces tore it down, they did not just steal metal. They severed his connection to his flock and left his parish isolated in an eerie, unnatural silence. He spent his days walking through a village that had forgotten its own rhythm, waiting for a miracle. On the other side of the shifting front line stood Major Klaus von Richter. He was 46 years old, born into an old aristocratic military family in Hanover, and currently serving as a logistics commander for the Regional Occupation Authority. Von Richter wore a perfectly tailored wool uniform, unspotted by the thick autumn mud, and kept his black leather riding boots polished to a high mirror shine. He wore an iron cross tightly secured to his collar. He believed completely in the absolute supremacy of total industrial mobilization, often stating to his subordinates that sentimentality was a luxury the weak could not afford. To him, centuries of cultural heritage were entirely meaningless when compared to the immediate raw material needs of the war effort. He viewed the ancient handcrafted instruments of European faith as nothing more than raw scrap metal, waiting to be melted down into artillery shell casings. He was the officer who signed the formal requisition order that stripped the belfry bare. The systematic collection of community property across occupied Western Europe had reached its absolute peak by the latter half of 1942. The Axis war machine faced severe, compounding resource shortages as the conflict on the Eastern Front consumed vast amounts of industrial material. Berlin had issued strict, top-down directives to strip every occupied territory of its functional and historical metals to supply the factories of the Ruhr Valley. Strategic metals like copper, tin, and bronze were prioritized above all else. Local occupation authorities implemented these orders with cold, bureaucratic efficiency, ignoring all regional appeals and spiritual exemptions. Millions of European citizens watched helplessly as teams of workers disassembled the structural history of their towns. Many Allied tactical commanders advancing through France routinely dismissed these civilian losses as the unfortunate but inevitable cost of total war. Frontline officers were entirely consumed by fuel shortages, broken supply lines, and the immediate tactical problem of breaching the defensive positions of the German borderlands. Small-scale thefts, property damage, and the loss of cultural artifacts were frequently overlooked or filed away under low-priority administrative paperwork. Civil affairs officers rarely had the transport resources or the operational clearance to track down stolen civilian property while major combat operations were still actively raging. The physical voice of the countryside was being systematically melted down into weaponry, and few men in uniform had the time or the inclination to notice. A single request regarding a missing village timepiece seemed entirely insignificant against the backdrop of a continent-wide advance. Yet, the silent church tower in the recently cleared sector near Luneville remained an unresolved fracture in the local landscape, waiting for a commander who viewed liberation as something more than just terrain gained on a map. Captain Arthur Vance, a 34-year-old civil affairs officer from Richmond, Virginia, serving with the 3rd United States Army, walked into the captured regional logistics depot outside Luneville. He found Major Klaus von Richter sitting behind a large oak desk, casually inspecting a pair of clean leather gloves. Vance placed the formal civilian petition on the desk. He asked if the major had an inventory of the confiscated property stored in the main warehouse. Von Richter did not look up from his gloves. He said that all materials in the depot were now the property of the High Command and would be processed according to military necessity. Vance adjusted his helmet and stated that the local population had rights under international agreements regarding historical religious property. Von Richter laughed softly. He said that a village church has no rights when the state requires metal for artillery ammunition. Vance pointed to the petition, explaining that the missing bells was 300 years old and belonged to the community of Saint Martin. Von Richter stood up, his polished boots clicking against the concrete floor. He said that the French people must learn that their antiquities are entirely worthless compared to the industrial output of a superior nation. He added that the bell was merely scrap bronze waiting for the furnace, and no amount of civilian whimpering would alter its destination. Vance took a step forward, his voice remaining level as he reminded the major that the area was now under American operational control. Von Richter shrugged his shoulders. He said that the Americans could play at being protectors all they wanted, but the metal belonged to those who had the strength to take it. He stated that he would not waste his men's time searching through tons of salvaged material for a piece of old metal. Vance realized that talking to the logistics officer was completely useless. The man's ideological arrogance was entirely absolute. The captain picked up his paperwork, turned on his heel, and walked out of the office without saying another word. He knew this went far beyond standard civil affairs disputes. He climbed into his utility vehicle and instructed his driver to head directly to the Advanced Headquarters Group. He drafted a formal report detailing the major's total refusal to cooperate and the specific location of the stored regional artifacts. The written report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the gate. 4 stars on his helmet, ivory revolvers on his belt. The general walked in unannounced. Every man in the room snapped to attention as the heavy oak door swung open. The air became completely still. Patton studied the German major for a single, freezing moment. He did not raise his voice. His tone was quiet, cold, and controlled. Patton looked at the desk. He asked the major if he was the officer responsible for sorting the confiscated property in this sector. Von Richter stood straight and stated that he was. Patton asked if the major had personally ordered the removal of historical items from local churches. Von Richter replied that he had done so under direct orders to secure materials for the war industry. Patton asked if the major had refused to locate the bell belonging to the parish of St. Martin. Von Richter said he had, because tactical efficiency could not be disrupted for civilian sentimentality. Patton stepped closer. He said the major had spoken of strength and industrial necessity. He said the major believed that a superior nation had the right to silence a community and strip its history for scrap. Patton stated that the German army had spent years taking the voices of others because they lacked the strength to face a quiet world. He said that a professional soldier does not wage war against a village timepiece or a priest's parish. He contrasted the major's polished uniform with the silent misery of the people who had lived under his shadow for 2 long years. Patton looked at the logistics officer. He gave the major a binary choice, he said. The major would immediately take a detail of his own captured men into the warehouse and locate the specific bronze bell inscribed with the name of Saint Martin. He stated that if the major failed to find that exact bell within the next 60 minutes, he would be stripped of his rank and forced to personally clear the minefields along the advance route with his bare hands. Patton said the choice belonged to the major, but the silence in the valley would end today. Von Richter stared at the floor, his face completely pale, his arrogance entirely broken. He gave a short, silent nod. Major von Richter personally led the captured logistics detail into the dark, cold depths of the storage warehouse. The German soldiers scrambled through the massive rows of crates and piled metal equipment, their hands trembling as they moved heavy iron casings and salvaged machinery under the watchful eyes of American military guards. The air inside the building smelled of rust, damp concrete, and stale oil. Within 40 minutes of intensive searching, the men uncovered a large wooden crate near the back wall containing several heavy bronze pieces. They pried open the timber frame to reveal the ancient church bell, its green patina covering the cast inscription that read fondu on 1644. Église Saint-Martin, an American heavy transport truck, delivered the massive historic artifact directly to the village square later that afternoon. A team of combat engineers quickly rigged a heavy steel hoist and block system over the open stone belfry, slowly lifting the 300-year-old bronze piece back into its original home. Father Dupont climbed the wooden stairs of the dark tower as the entire population of the valley gathered in the muddy street below. The old priest grabbed the worn hemp rope with both hands and pulled down with all his weight. The deep, heavy ring of the bronze bell echoed across the valley for the first time in 2 years, causing farmers to stop dead in the distant fields and women to step out onto their doorways in absolute disbelief. General Patton stood in the square below, pulled off his helmet, and looked up at the shaking tower as the continuous sound filled the air. Father Dupont remained in his parish near Luneville for the rest of his natural life. He woke every morning to the sound of the bronze clock striking the hour. A constant reminder of the day, the heavy silence finally broke. He continued to baptize the infants, marry the young couples, and bury the elders of the valley until his peaceful passing in 1964. The ancient bell he pulled with his own hands still stands in the stone belfry of Saint Martin, untouched by time. Major Klaus von Richter spent the final months of the conflict managing secondary supply lines before being captured by Allied forces near the Rhine. He was stripped of his decorations and spent 4 years in a military labor camp before returning to a completely transformed Germany. He lived out his remaining years working as a quiet clerk in a shipping firm in Hanover, never speaking of his wartime service or the logistics depot near Luneville. He died in bitterness in 1978, completely forgotten by the system he had served so efficiently. General Patton never mentioned the hunt for the missing French artifact in his official operational reports. He briefly noted the incident in a personal letter to his wife, writing that a soldier must sometimes repair the small fractures of war before he can hope to conquer the larger ones. The simple administrative file regarding the recovery of the village timepiece remained buried in the Army archives for decades, a quiet testament to an act of mercy that a brutal conflict could not wash away. Some historians have argued that General Patton's heavy operational intervention to recover a single community artifact was an unnecessary expenditure of military resources during a highly critical phase of the European campaign. They contend that a frontline commander should have focused his complete attention and logistics assets entirely on the tactical destruction of opposing forces rather than civilian civil affairs. Others have argued the opposite, maintaining that such decisive acts of restorative justice were absolutely essential to rebuilding local trust and demonstrating the true moral contrast between occupation and liberation. What is certain is that the physical return of the historic timepiece remains a permanent documented milestone in the wartime memory of the region. If you had been in General Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have left the village to its silence while focusing solely on tactical objectives? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about humanity in the darkest places, make sure to subscribe.